I'm Jinty Rorke and I'm talking to Wynnton Poole. Today is the 14th of August 1997 and we're at Wynnton's house in 5th Avenue. This is our second tape. Wynnton, we're back in Katikati and you've just been telling us about all the new furniture you got when you were married. So how was life on the farm with a new wife?
Well, you know what it is for young married couples, very much in love with each other. Life was very wonderful. Because of the pulling the grass caterpillar, I was still very hard up. And just to make things more difficult, we were heavily, rationed on our fertiliser. First of all, you were rationed to 2/5 of the fertiliser that you had used, in average used in the last 3 years, which brought me down from 25 tonnes a year to 10. And the following year again, we were rationed to 7/10 of that, which brought me down to 7 tonnes, which made life very, very hard. I was using anything I could lay my hands on for fertiliser, stock food, anything at all. And so that side was difficult. We had, for a long while, we had help on the farm. And we had a young boy called Archie Humphreys. His father, Goody Humphreys, was well known around town as a stock drover and things like that. Archie was a strange lad. He was a very thin little boy. His mother had died some years before. And anyway, he came to work for us. His most notable thing that he ever did was he was walking past the fertiliser shed one day and he saw us stoat asleep in the sun. So he crept into the garage, walked the door, it was still there, and he jumped on it and killed it. So that's what the most natural thing Archie ever did.
Gracious.
One day we were working down in the gully, it was rather hot, and Archie started to peel off. He had about 6 layers of clothes on, including his pyjamas. You mean, there was a character, a child. Anyway, time went and he went back to town. He, being a tiny little skinny child, he eventually became quite a big man, became a policeman, but died quite young. Of course, the next excitement on the farm was the birth of our first son, Harry. You've got to realise that Francis was just getting on for 35 when Harry was born, and so Dr. Joe Burstein dieted her very hard because he expected the child to be big. Well, unfortunately, he was still very big, but he was very, very thin. Sister Grieve was the matron at the old Katikati hospital, which Harry was one of the first babies born there. And she said to him, Francis, Mrs. Poole, you got plenty of milk, let him have all he wants, he'll get a sore bottom, but I'll look after that. And would you believe it, in the fortnight the women were kept in hospital those days, he put on 2 pounds in weight and grew up to be a very strong, healthy man. He was 6'3" when he died.
Whereabouts was the hospital in Katikati?
Where the old people's home is now, in Beach Road. I think it's Beach Road. And they've just closed it down to turn it into an old people's home, I think, or something.
Right.
Or I think the Maoris might be getting it back even.
I think the old people's home's moved, hasn't it?
So that was that. He was followed 18 months later by Frank, 15 months later by Jim, and I think 13 months later by Felicity, which a lot of children of ours have to look after in a short space of time. But she was a wonderful mother. She never complained. I don't suppose she suffered much with morning sickness or anything like that. She was just a wonderful, wonderful person. Well, shortly after this, going back to my days on the old farm at Pius Power, I had a serious accident. I was over rolling a paddock one day with hard-fed horses, and the roller was a paddock that had been ploughed with a swan plough, turning enormous furrows, 26 inches wide and 10 inches deep. It was very rough. And I couldn't sit on the seat. because it was, too rough. And I couldn't run behind, so I was standing on the platform balancing. And my little sister, who was only age 6, came over with a cup of tea for me and called out, "Whoa." The horses stopped, and I went over the front, hit the friskiest of the 3 horses, and the roller went over my body, right up over my left shoulder, just missed my head. I got over it all right at that time, but just before war broke out, I was out weeding young barberry hedges on a bitterly cold day in July. I got a chill which turned to rheumatic fever. It was never proved that I had rheumatic fever, but we lived 24 miles from our doctor in Tauranga in those days. Dr. Joe Burston, in the meantime, had left Katikati. No, he hadn't arrived at Katikati. And anyway, Dr. Thomas Stewart said, Dad, you'll have to be careful of this boy. He's touch and go for rheumatic fever. Well, my feet and hands were so swollen I could barely squeeze my feet into the shoes without lacing them up. I was in terrible pain. My temperature had been 105 for days, and my mother said, "You had rheumatic fever." I don't care what the doctors say. Anyway, I lost a tremendous lot of weight, and I was very ill for a year. Every time I did any manual work, the joints and my wrists and so on would swell up and so on. Anyway, by the time Frances and I got married, I had got over it. She knew about it, and she was still taking a risk marrying a man who was the subject of this sort of thing. And 2 or 3 times a year, without any warning at all, I would suddenly, my back would collapse. And I'd be in bed for anything up to 3 weeks, not even able to sit up without help. And as we at this time had no help left, Frances was milking 60 cows by herself, looking after 3 children and a partially disabled husband, and she never complained. Our next door neighbour, Jeff Faulkner, used to come and feed the pigs and cart the cream out for her, but she coped with everything else. Well, later on, we managed to get a return service man, Matthew Wilson. He'd been sent back from the islands with osteomyelitis in one leg, so he was only allowed to do light work, but at least he could help the milking and that sort of thing with hours later. And life was still financially being very difficult. Anyway, about this time, the government sent out a group a committee around the farmers of Katikati, urging them to grow vegetables for the Americans in the islands, the American troops. And they gave contracts to various farmers. One of the important things about these contracts is you got almost unlimited supplies of fertilizer. And so we undertook to grow 3 acres of carrots, for which we were supposed to get £1,500. We worked terribly hard. I mean, carrots have to be weeded, they have to be thinned and so forth. And Egmont Gold carrots would be about 18 inches long and about 2 inches through. They were beautiful carrots. And we had a wonderful crop. But lo and behold, along came the committee and said they had a glut of vegetables and they didn't want them. They paid us £300 to plough the carrots in. Well, away went the committee. Frances and I decided that they wouldn't be likely to come back again, and that rather than plough the carrots in, we'd feed them to the cows. Now, the flush months on a dairy farm are November and December. Well, we had a fairly large truck, a 3-ton truck, but we fed out a load of those every day to the cows and another load to the pigs. And our flush months were February and March. They were so full of carrots that even their dung was red. We sent away lots more pigs, and in one way and another, of course, New Zealand benefited by this extra production. We didn't feel at all sorry that we had done it. And so that was that. But the extra fertilizer, of course, was very, very important to us. Anyway, after Felicity was born, we had 4 years break, and then we had 3 more children, Duncan, Evelyn, and Roger. Roger was born about the week that Hillary climbed Everest. He was a very energetic baby, right from the time he was born. He'd wiggle himself in his cot up against the bars at the head and bruise his head. The nurses christened him Tensing. Well, that was the end of our family, thank goodness. And but they were a wonderful family. There's no room for selfishness in big families. The big ones looked after the little ones. And it was a happy family. After the war, well, the life just continued, as life does generally on the farm. Not terribly exciting, but we were a very happy family, still very hard up. And we did change from dairying to sheep and dry stock. The farm really was too small to make a great success of it, but at the same time, something very important happened. By this time, we not only had the Purina grass caterpillar, we also had the ordinary grass grub in the pastures. And I was having great difficulty in making 1,000 bales of hay a year, when the authorities started making DDT fertilizer. You had so much 50% DDT in per ton of fertilizer. And it was fairly expensive, but I waited for a year and the results seemed to be good. So I decided to top dress half the farm with DDT fertilizer. And lo and behold, next year we made 2,800 bales of hay, and I gave away huge swags of heavy toppings to neighbours who made hay of that. I mean, the improvement was absolutely incredible. So the following year, I top dressed the rest of the farm with DDT fertilizer. That year, we were now making our hay with a stationary hay baler, which I was in partnership with another farmer with over, and we were carting the hay in on bales of hay in on trucks to this baler. It was dealt with, turned into bales of hay, and loading up the bales to take the shed, and one bale was dropped on my head and nearly broke my neck. I was not able to do much work for several months, and it was sufficiently bad for us to consider selling our hill country farm of 304 acres and look for another farm which was nearer to town, nearer to my parents, and nearer to my mother-in-law, who was now about 90, and in fact she was 91. And after a good deal of trouble, we found a delightful farm on Wairua Road, right? On Wairua Road, and it was only a much smaller farm. It was only 85 acres, but it had a beautiful lot of river flats. It was on a tar-sealed roads. The children were able to get their sports easily. They all had bicycles. And we were very happy. My mother-in-law, we were going down to the mount to see her about twice a week. My father's health was deteriorating. He was on massive amounts of medication. I think the doctors were using him for a guinea pig. And anyway, it got to the stage of my mother-in-law died in... No, my father died first, I think. He died on the 12th of April. Yes, we were going down to the mount, that's right. He was at this stage suffering from Parkinson's and was in a wheelchair. And he was a grumpy old man. I think my mother didn't have a very easy life. And anyway, we called in to see him on our way down to the mount to do things for my mother-in-law, and we had one of the children with us. And the old man was absolutely full of beans this day, giving the child cheek and so on. We set off for the Mount. Mother wheels him into the bedroom to try and heave him back onto his bed. We were meant to do something at the stove, went out to do it. When he went back, he was dead. He just fallen forward out of his chair, never made a sound. So dead. So we had that to cope with then. My sister and her husband, who was the Ford agent in Tipperary, had a delightful house in Tipperary, but they also had a double section. My sister inherited their house at what's the name of the wretched road? Grace Road.
Right.
Sold it and built my mother a new, delightful little 2-bedroom house on the spare section, having sent mother off to Sydney to stay with her sisters for 6 months. Mother had 4 years of a wonderful time there in her new home. And from, as I said, my mother-in-law died in September the same year. And strangely enough, Frances' brother, her younger brother, who had drowned many years before in England, off a big yacht in England, but her elder brother and Frances, of course, inherited their mother's estate. Her section on Molineux Road, where Elizabeth Gardens after was 3/5 of an acre, and we sold it for £3,500, which was a going price in those days. That section is now worth £1 million, and they're building a 10-storey building on it.
Well, you can't see into the future, can you?
You can't see the future, but you do regret some of the mistakes you've made. Anyway, we, about this time, because my boys were growing up, Harry had determined right from the start, of early in life, when he was about 7, he was going to be a priest. And he had gone off to St. John's College to study for the ministry. Frank had gone into the Navy as well, they called them stokers in those days, although they hadn't shoveled coal for donkey's years, and really engineers. And they were about to go on a 3-month voyage somewhere. He had married and had a baby girl. And he and a group of other sailors came down by car to Hamilton on a Saturday, expecting to see a football match, but couldn't find parking. So they went on to Whakatane, where one of the other boys' mother lived. They were pub crawling as well on the way and not wearing seat belts. And at Te Teko they had a terrible accident. Frank was the front seat passenger. He was thrown right through the windscreen. One eye was knocked out. The bones of his face were shattered. And the car following him was a doctor's wife, who presumably was a nurse, rolled him over on his middle and held him up so he wouldn't drown in his own blood. When they finally got him to Whakatane Hospital, the sister took one look at him and fainted. They sent him on to Hamilton the next day, not expecting him to get there alive. And I believe they spent the next 3 days and nights taking X-ray pictures and wiring up his face. The eye, of course, they could do nothing about. But anyway, he's managed to survive, and he became an interstate coach driver in Australia years later. Jim, number 3, decided to be a civil engineer, did very well at varsity, cost us practically nothing to keep him there in those days. And in his 3rd year, before he graduated, he asked permission. He was on a Ministry of Works bursary. He asked permission to go over to Australia, to Munmora, to study a coal-fired power station, and was given permission on condition that he did a mini thesis on it when he came back. So Jim was very thorough, He did lots of diagrams and photographs and did a 40-page foolscap essay on it, which I'm still convinced in my own mind, and I think he is too, that when he graduated, he was put straight in charge of the widening of the Nowranga Gorge down into Wellington. He had to report daily to the resident engineer who was at Johnsonville, but he was on the job and did in charge of the gorge. He was on that for 18 months, then went into headquarters of motorway design and decided to do a working holiday around the world. He went to Canada, where he had already been told not to try and get work in the cities, but to get out into the country, which quite suited him. He went right up to Haines Junction in BC and worked on a hydro dam there. Now, what the thickness of ice they get, how they keep hydroelectric going in the winter, I don't know. But anyway, he did. He was on that for about 18 months, I think. Then was taken into Edmonton, where he worked on the design of diesel-operated generating systems for the small towns in the outback. And he designed several of these power stations and installed them. And he had various, jobs. He eventually lost that job. He had a change of head at the headquarters. And this man was about the same age as Jim and just wanted to change everything. Jim told him straight out that a lot of his ideas wouldn't work. And when they didn't work, of course, there was friction between the two of them. We went over to Canada. Francis and I went to Canada in 1978 and stayed with Jim and Carol, his new wife. And I was introduced to his bank manager at the time. He was a very charming man. And among other things, he asked me how many growing days we had a year in New Zealand. I said, well, you could say 300. It doesn't stop growing for the other 65. He said, well, of course, we only have 5 months growing in Canada. But they do have, in the summertime, 24 hours a day of sunlight. And so things grow enormously quickly. So that was that. We enjoyed ourselves very much. Jim and Carol, we had a very pleasant trip back to Vancouver, several days travelling. Went through the very famous wildlife park and saw bears and all sorts of other interesting animals, and ended up in Vancouver, went to Butchart Gardens and met Carol's parents, and we set off back for New Zealand, not having seen a moose, which Francis very much wanted to see. Anyway, Jim and Carol set off back to Edmonton to find a note on his desk asking him to resign. So he got $5,000 severance pay and 3 months holiday and had another job in a fortnight. This time they were building a whole new town to service the tar sands. Tar sands, there are several areas of them in Alberta. They are another source of oil. It's an expensive process. I think the oil has to be steamed out of the tar. But anyway, they built a whole new town, and Jim went into building. He became very proficient at that. He really is a very clever man. And he ended up, when that job was finished, he ended up by working for a developer in Edmonton, and he built 3 very fine buildings. The first was a 12-storied block on Jasper Avenue, the main street, which was 7 floors of it were taken over by the Alberta government. The second one was a very large apartment block, very attractive building, clad on the outside with red brick, on three levels, because of a small internal airport in the middle of the city. I think it took 1.5 million bricks to face this building, it was so big. And then later on, he did a 20-story apartment block on the other side of the river.
Well, Wynnton, perhaps we should come back to New Zealand again.
Right.
So what was going on with the rest of the family?
So in the meantime, the next one, of course, is Felicity, who decided to be a school teacher. She went to the Hamilton Teachers Training College and eventually became a fully qualified teacher. She was very bright. And actually, when she was she did her last year when we went to Tauranga at the Te Puna Primary School, and the headmaster told Frances that she was the second cleverest child he ever taught. She was right. She did very well at girls' college and then went on to the Teachers Training College. Her first job as a PA teacher was at Pillars Point.
That must have been quite a new school then, was it?
It was quite new, and it's always been a very nice school from a social point of view. They're mostly children of professional people out there, and there was a very nice headmaster, and she enjoyed it very much. Her second job was at Matahina, where she had to do her country service. The chairman of the board there was an old friend, and very kindly built a very nice batch for her attached to their house. And she was a very shy girl, but he and his wife took her to social dues and so forth, and got used to the fact that young men didn't necessarily bite young girls. And they had a very, very good headmaster with whom she had a wonderful rapport, and she enjoyed that very much. From there, she went on to teaching near Henderson, in the Henderson area. And about this time, Duncan had gone into the Navy, and his particular friend, Robert Burns, he brought him home one time. The upshot was eventually Robert and Felicity got married. Bob eventually got out of the Navy and became a carpenter. He did extremely well. He's a very hard worker, very neat in his work. And they were quite happy. They had a little boy, and later on they decided to go to Canada. Jim was there already, and I'm not too sure Roger hadn't already got there too. Jim anyway was there, and they decided to set off and see a bit of the world. They started off with Canada. Well, they were in Edmonton for 4 years, had their own house. They went over with a fair amount of capital. Bob had loads of work. He did a tremendous lot of work on several of the shops in the West Mall, Edmonton Mall, which is the biggest shopping mall in the world. Covers about 100 acres with its car parks. And Franz and I, in the meantime, I had, this was getting complicated. To go back many, many years, 1935, I became a registered licensed lay reader in the Anglican Church. 38 years later, when I retired from farming, Frances and I, for something to do, worked at Holy Trinity in Tauranga. I looked after the grounds and the outside of the buildings, and she looked after the interior. We worked very hard. We loved the old church. It had been our, one of our bright spots in all our lives. And we even used to scrub the floor of the parish hall twice a year. And at that time, not many young clergy were coming out of St. John's College, and it was becoming quite a worry. And at the synod in 19... about 1970, it was suggested that they might consider training qualified or gifted men to be non-stipendiary priests. Clifford Barber, who was our vicar at the time, asked me if I would be interested. Well, of course, you always left straight away with the feelings you're not good enough and that sort of thing. And so he said, well, go home and talk to Francis about it, pray about it, and let me know how you feel. So I had a long talk with a very old priest friend and told him how I felt, and he advised me to go ahead. So I let Clifford Barber know, and eventually the bishop came up to Tauranga, Bishop Paul Reeves, and he rang me up and asked Francis and me to meet him at St George's Vicarage Gate Park the next morning. He was very keen to make sure that Francis was keen for me to go ahead with this. And but of course she came of a very churchy family. Her grandfather and great-grandfather were both Church of England clergy. Her mother's eldest brother, Bishop Wallace, became the third Bishop of Wellington, and so she was well used to church life, and she was quite keen. And so the bishop said to me, "Oh, Mr. Poole, I'm left with a problem. If I ordain you, I can't move you. If I have an unpopular vicar, I can move him on somewhere else and try him. But this is your home, and if I ordain you and you're not popular, they're stuck with you." So that was all right. I was eventually accepted for training and was the first person in the Waipu diocese so accepted. The bishop decided that I should do my studies under the Church's Education Commission rather than go to St John's College. I don't know why he chose that, but he did. And I consider that I left school at 15, only in the end of the fourth form year. It was 50 years since I'd been at school. I was very pleased with my results of my exams. I should have studied 9 subjects altogether. 6 of them were compulsory and 3 would have been optional. However, with many hours of reading and writing every day, my eyes, by the time I had done 1 optional subject, my eyes were playing up very badly, and the bishop, my results were so good, he let me off the last 2 optional subjects, which meant I never got a certificate of Christian education. But I did end up with 2 A's, 3 A minuses, and 1 B plus. And the last one, B to B plus, I done that the wrong way round. I should have done that later, after some of the other subjects. I'd have understood better what they were driving at. And finally, I wasn't the first person ordained at the time. One woman was ordained a month before me, Cherry Baker. She had a station in what afterwards was my parish. Her husband died of cancer at the age of under 40, leaving her with 5 children. And in her loneliness, she studied extramurally for her LTH and got it. So she was ready for ordination by the time I was starting on my studies. Eventually, she was ordained 1 month before me, and I was ordained deacon on the 16th of March, 1974, and priested on the 6th of October, 1974.
And you were
I was licensed as assistant curate at Holy Trinity, Tauranga. It was the longest serving assistant curate they ever had. I was there for 14 years.
So who were the vicars while you were curate at Holy Trinity?
Mm-hmm.
Who were the vicars while you were curate there?
Well, Clifford Barber was when I started studying, but Jack Trindle was the vicar when I was finally ordained. There is a picture in one of those things of a group of... This photograph that you're looking at now was taken soon after my ordination of Francis and me out at the farm. It was a very happy ministry. Actually, Bishop Poole gave me the care of elderly people in Tauranga. And as I had lived in Tauranga, or near Tauranga, within the Bay of Plenty, and within the Tauranga County, nearly all my life, I knew a great many people, and it was a very happy ministry indeed. I was, later on I went down for 16 months to look after a parish at Waipoa near Gisborne, but before that I was looking after 6 old people's homes in Tauranga, as well as a great many people that own homes privately, all on a fortnightly basis, and it was a very happy ministry.
Did you serve all the time in Tauranga?
No, I had 16 months. I was actually given 18 when I looked after a parish in Gisborne, where the vicar was in England on sabbatical holiday, and it was a very happy time. I was rather shy. In those days, the sheep farmers were the aristocracy of New Zealand. They were wealthy and so forth. I just wondered how I'd fit in. But however, they were so kind to us. They made such a fuss of Francis and me. We made many very permanent, very good friends. In a sense, it was a lovely little parish. Most of the well-to-do sheep farmers, when they retired, went into the town to live, and their sons carried on in the stations. And I ended up by taking, in 16 months, 6 funerals, 17 weddings, and 39 baptisms, which was very satisfactory from a priestly point of view. But before we go any further, I think I'll have to go back a little bit and discuss Harry. Harry left boys' college, and he was too young to go to St John's College, so he worked for a year for the New Zealand Insurance Company. Then he went up and stayed at the Auckland City Mission until he was old enough to go to St John's. He eventually ended up, he was very, very good at Greek, and was top of his class all the way through. Anyway, he was eventually ordained priest. You could not be ordained before you were 23, and he was only 3 weeks old enough to be ordained by Archbishop Lesser. He served his curacy at Rotorua 3 years, and then the Archbishop was overseas, and the Board of Nominations decided to send Harry to Rotorua. I believe that when the Archbishop came back, he was very cross about it because he said it was no place to send a young single priest, very lonely, and with large stations, people a long way apart and so on. However, he had 6 very happy years there. And the unusual thing is that he was priested long before I started studying for the ministry. So eventually, when it came to my ordination, Bishop Poole gave him the job of preaching the sermon. Now, that is quite unusual. It wouldn't be unusual, perhaps, for a father to preach at his son's ordination, but it would definitely be unusual for a son to preach at his father's ordination. So,
let's have a look at the photograph we've got of you and Harry together.
Right. The photograph you're going to see now is a photograph of Harry with me. Harry is wearing the coat, and it was at the consecration of his new church of St Luke's, Manurewa. One of the very wonderful things in my ministry that happened was that Harry, after leaving Rotorua, served for 2 years at Kawarau. He loved Kawarau and was prepared to stay for 10 years, but he was invited to go to St Paul's, Simon Street. He spoke to the bishop about it. St Paul's is very high church. It is also very charismatic, and the bishop said it's a very special parish. and he would certainly never be given the opportunity again. So he went up and became the co-vicar, I think, at St. Paul's. And while there, he met Jasmine Sampson, who was one of the St. Paul's singers. They fell in love with each other, and I had the joy of marrying them on the 1st of January, New Year's Day, at the communion service. It was a Sunday.
What year was that, Wynnton?
I think it was 1978. He was very, but this, he was at St. Paul's for 3 years, and he, as I say, I married them, and then the dean and the archdeacon both asked him if he would consider going to Manurewa, which had been without a vicar, in charge of a curate for some time. They prayed about it very earnestly, but they didn't really want to leave St. Paul's. But anyway, eventually went. He was very happy there. He served for 12 and a half years at Manurewa. And it went down. They had 3 boys, Matthew, Nicholas. Nicholas, unfortunately, was born with a double cataract. And so is now has very poor eyesight, and Simon is the youngest. They eventually left Manurewa after 12 and a half years and went down to St. Luke's, Hamilton, and he was there doing very, very happy and doing very well. He became the person responsible for arranging retreats and quiet days for the diocese, and then he and Jasmine were head of the marriage support group for New Zealand. He died very suddenly on March the 16th. He got out of bed to go to the toilet, went back to bed and started to groan. Jasmine couldn't get any sense out of him, sent for an ambulance. They knew what was wrong with him, but they took a scan or something, I don't know, sent for the bishop, who arrived and gave him the last rites, and he died in about 4 hours of an aneurysm and hemorrhage of the brain. It was an enormous funeral at the cathedral. I gave a talk on Harry's life. It was greatly complimented by the various clergy and clergy afterwards. And so it was obviously Harry got his very good preaching ability from his father, which was very kind of them. Jasmine was given a large sum of money by the Clergy Pension Board to buy a house. She was already preparing to study for ordination. She went up to St. John's College, has had 3 years there, and will be ordained, and she's already ordained a priest, and she will be graduated Bachelor of Theology at the end of this year. Her career from now on, of course, is in her own hands. I can't say what she will be prepared to do. She has a very nice house in Hamilton, and I think she and the 2 younger boys, may go back there. Matthew may decide to stop in Auckland to go to Polytech.
And what happened to the rest of the family?
The rest of my family? Well, where have we got to? Duncan? Have we mentioned Duncan?
Yeah, I think we probably need to move on.
Yeah.
A bit.
Well, Duncan went into the Navy and ended up after 12 years as a petty officer engineer. He spent his last year in the Navy putting all the naval stores on the computer, so he obviously has plenty of brains. Evelyn became a nun, a sister at the Community of the Sacred Name. She was a lovely person, a graduate of Massey University with a Bachelor of Science. She was being prepared after several years in the community. She was actually being prepared to become the next Mother Superior, being trained for it, was sent to the Daughter House of Fiji as part of her experience, training novices over there, returned back to Christchurch, and a couple of months or so later she had a complete bowel blockage. She was a brilliant swimmer. They looked absolutely marvellous when she got back, and the doctors just wouldn't believe there's anything seriously wrong with her until they operated. Oh, and so she couldn't swallow anymore. They were feeding her through her veins, and when they operated, she was so riddled with cancer that they didn't even try to prolong her life. Physically, she was a very strong woman. They gave her 12 months to live, and she lived for 18. A tremendous funeral service for her. She was so well known that they had the requiem and funeral service in Christchurch and 3 memorial services in different parts of New Zealand the same day: Dunedin, Tauranga and Papakura. She was very greatly missed. She was tremendously loved, and it took a long time, and it actually, I think it contributed to France's death. I've mentioned going to Waipoa, haven't I? And I had 16 months there, was very happy, came back to town and resumed my work here as the assistant curate. Then about this time, I started having trouble with cancer in my lower jaw. I had 3 operations in 3 months, and each time it was the pieces they take away were malignant. And so eventually, Mr. Mountford, had an operation on the outside of my jaw, cut the muscles, and they managed to take away a sufficiently large amount to get past the malignant area. He said to me at the time, by this time, Frances had died. 1990 was a terrible year. When Evelyn got her cancer, when I went to the hospital for my 3rd operation, Frances went down with an absolutely massive dose of shingles, brought on with worry. She lived in great pain for 12 months. Evelyn, on January the 12th, 1990, Harry and Jasmine and the children had 12 months in England on an exchange parish there. They were on their way back and were due in on the 13th of January. We had gone up to meet them and had just got into the vicarage, having got the keys from the secretary. And the phone rang to say that Russell, my brother's only son, had drowned. Bill was a very fine young man, very, very highly respected. He used to train young footballers. He had a very, very big kiwi fruit orchard and other things, avocados and waratahs and things like that. When he first started this orchard, of course, they were getting $10 a tray for their kiwi fruit. And he built a very large and very expensive house for his wife. And all was going well until the kiwi fruit price collapsed. He had a very big mortgage and had to then manage the place on his own. At his funeral, no, I'm getting ahead of myself again. He used to work so hard that on a calm night he would spend the whole night spraying so as not to worry the neighbours. He was very tired. He and the family went for holiday to the next bay up beyond Whitianga, and Bill was diving for scallops with a friend who was the manager of the Rural Bank in Hamilton. They were in 70 feet of water. The friend went over and tapped Bill on his tank to let him know the tank was getting a bit low. He had half a bag of scallops, had to swim very hard to get to the surface, called out to the friend who was manning the boat, who turned round, turned his back on Bill to pull up the anchor, and he turned round, Bill had gone. And they're quite certain that he had a blackout and just sank back into the water and drowned. It was a terrible tragedy. Evelyn, my daughter, the nun, died of cancer 12 days later on the 24th of January. Harry and Jasmine had arrived home on 13th, and I said to him, "You must go down to Christchurch. I think she's waiting for you." He had 3 days there, but said she was so ill he only got about 2 or 3 hours real speech with her. He passed his own wife in the Christchurch airport. Jasmine went and spent 3 or 4 days with Evelyn, wrote a song for her, which she afterwards sang at the memorial service in Tauranga. Francis died on the 24th of May, which was very sad. It took me a long while to get it over all these troubles. And I had to retire, give up working. I was 80, admittedly, 1990, to nurse Frances before she died. And when she had died, I just told the vicar I couldn't stop working. And so I've been living a retired life since. Frances and I had bought a very nice retirement home, 4-bedroom brick house in Myer Street. And we were very happy there. We were very fortunate that we never had much money, but we did have 2 or 3 trips overseas due to money that was left to us. And in my 16 months in Gisborne, we were quite well off. For once we had a small private income. It was only about 3,300 a year between us, but we also had our universal, and for the one and only time in my life as a priest, I was paid. So when we left there, we had 5 months overseas, 2 months in Canada, 3 months in England and Europe. And so I've always been so glad that we had that wonderful trip together before she died. After Frances died, I lived alone for 5 years. I grieved quite seriously for a couple of years, I think, but I had got over that. I couldn't say I'm really a lonely person, but I do find life on my own rather boring when you have nobody to share anything with. And after about 5 years, my family were getting concerned about me living alone and found this very nice unit in Fifth Avenue, Fifth Avenue, and I have moved in here and I've been here now for 2 years and I'm very happy. I will be 89 next birthday, and I haven't got an ache or a pain. I'm really very, very fortunate.
Looking back over all these years in the Tauranga district, Wynnton, what sticks out most in your memory?
Well, consider the fact that when I was a baby, the borough population, I believe, was 1,100. It was about 4,300, I think, when we were married. It became about 5,000 odd when the government decided to make the port the official port for the timber industry. And of course, the growth of the port has influenced the growth of the city. Considering it was only 5,000 or so in 1953, and it's now officially 85,500, isn't it?
Something like that.
85,500. It's a growing city. It's been built in a time of good buildings. Most of the modern buildings are well built and attractive. And altogether, I can't see any end to the growth here. I don't particularly like living in big, busy cities. I sold my last car 7 years ago, and I walked for a long while. I recently bought a scooter because I was finding long walks difficult. And but I remember a good many characters. Perhaps I ought to tell you stories about about Sam Darrah.
Oh, yes, what a good idea.
Sam Darrah lived in 3rd Avenue. He was, I suppose, the son of an Irish family. He was a bit of a scamp in some ways. Like most Irishmen, he was horse mad. He kept a beautiful race horse called Tinnerpie in pastures empty sections in 2nd Avenue. Now, I've heard this story from 2 different sources at different times, so I think it's substantially true. Sam used to go around every day and get his horse and lead it home and groom it and then go for a ride. He went round one day and the horse was dead. It was a terrible shock to him. On the way back home, feeling a bit despondent, he met the chief of the local Judea Par. And he, being a very shrewd man, he quickly got a very funny idea into his head. He said to the chief, "Horry, would you like to buy Tinnerpie?" Oh, he said, "Sam, you won't sell Tinnerpie." He said, "I'll sell you Tinnerpie for 10 quid. No, Sam, you won't sell Tinnerpie. I will sell you Tinnerpie for 10 quid. Well, the Maori couldn't get hold of the money fast enough. Sam gave him the bridle and away he went. Shortly he came back and said, "Sam, Tinnerpie's dead." Sam said, "Is he? I'm very sorry for you, Horry," and let it go at that. Well, the Maori now had to get out of his difficulties. So he went back to the Par and he gathered all the young men around. He said, "Hey, you fellas, you know what? I bought Tinnerpie." God, Horry, Sam won't sell you Tinnerpie. He bought on me Tinnerpie and I bought him and I'm going to raffle him. 1 quid a ticket. Well, I don't know how much money he eventually got, but it was quite a lot. And then when the raffle was drawn, he gave the bridle to the one chap who'd won the draw. He set off, it was a long way from Judea Par to 2nd Avenue, but when he got back, he said, "Horry, Judea Par's dead." He said, "No." He said, "I tell you," he said, "I'm very sorry, here's your quid." The other story concerned Mr. Chaplin, who was farming quite a large block of land at Wakamarama and milling the land. He was an experienced sawmiller. It was quite a big sawmill. And as he cleared the land, he was grassing it. He built a fine big house, and he had a mob of young Poole Angus animals in his front paddock, which he used to go and look at lovingly every morning. And one morning when he went out, they were gone. Now, he didn't drive the car himself. This is one of his sons. "Get the car! Drive me to Skinner!" Skinner being the local policeman, whom some believed was in cahoots with Sam Darrah. Anyway, he marched into the police station and said, "Skinner, so-and-so Detective Inspector in Auckland's a personal friend of mine. I've lost 40 ponies and they're not back in my paddock by Monday morning. I'm going up to see him." The animals were back. And the third story concerned a horse belonging to Mr. Law, who was the headmaster of the Tauranga school. This horse disappeared. Now, I've already told you, my father was a keen fisherman man, and he was up shooting one day up at the bank run, and he found the horse in a paddock there. He went back and told Mr. Law, who said, "I'll get Sam Darrah to go and get it." Dad said, "If you've got this sense, you'll go and get it yourself." No, he said, "I'll get Sam Darrah to go and get it." Sam Darrah went, and the horse had disappeared. Dad was out hunting again shortly afterwards, and found the horse up in another paddock further back in the bush, and went back and told Mr. Laws again. He still wouldn't take any notice. He sent Sam Darrah to get the horse, and it was never seen again. So that's 3 stories about Sam Darrah. He was a native character in Tauranga.
So, did you know the Macmillans?
Oh, I knew the 2. Well, I remember old Mrs. Macmillan, the MP's wife. Yeah. She was a dear old lady, very absent-minded. She was very, very socially, very well bred. Her first cousin was the admiral in charge of the Renown when the Prince of Wales came out to New Zealand. And you didn't get those jobs lightly in England. But she was very, very forgetful. She could do the most... She was really quite eccentric, a very, very loving old lady. She was a very great friend of mine. On one occasion, some friends were going to visit her, and she put up the window and said, "Mrs. Macmillan is not at home today." Away they went. On another occasion, she invited Colonel and Mrs. Mayfield to come to lunch. They came. They sat in the sitting room. And finally, Mrs. Macmillan said, "Will you stay to lunch?" Went out into the kitchen to prepare the lunch and forgot all about them. Eventually, they crept out and saw her sitting there reading, and they went away. She was a darling old lady. Her two daughters, her husband, of course, was the Minister of Mines and Agriculture in the Coast government, and was our member until the 1935 election when the what you call the government lost its seat. Should say two parties combined? Coalition government. Yeah. Coalition government lost their election to Labour, and he lost his seat. He was a very, very hard-working man for the diocese. And his two daughters were very well. They had a son and two daughters. The son eventually managed about a 300-acre farm, I think, that he had at Katikati. The two daughters inherited a 50-acre property at Merivale. I'm not sure that they didn't buy another 50 acres. Eventually, when it became a suburb, it was all cut up, of course, they became very well off. Ray Macmillan was the elder. She was a trained nurse and died of a heart attack when they fairly said, no, she was quite old. Violet was very, very bright. They, of course, had been brought up in Katikati, and so when they had the Katikati centenary coming up, Vicky was the secretary to the committee. He was going out there, I think, several times a week to committee meetings. They made a tremendous success of the centennial do. When the night of the dinner, the big dinner, somebody laced her punch. And she had an accident on the way home. Oh, what a shame. Had a massive stroke, which left her speechless for a long while. I used to look after her, take communion to her, talk to her, and so on. She never lost her courage. It took her about 18 months to get her speech back. She eventually got the little electric car. It was like a glorified scooter, which she was able to drive around the place. But it was a very sad way to end up for a person who had been such an important, really important person in the borough. And I remember when we first came back to town from Katikati, they invited us to go in one evening and see slides. They both together had a very comprehensive trip around Europe, the Far East and so on. And we had all our children with us. And when you've looked at the slides for about 2 hours, your eyes get very tired. I was absolutely had it. And they'd been to England, they'd been to Russia, they'd been to Japan, they'd been to China, they'd been to everything. They got back and they'd gone to Italy when they decided to call it a day. And little Evelyn, age 7, piped up and said, "Didn't you go to Spain?" So then we had to see the Spanish slides. She was a very bright child, right? They thought she was wonderful.
The house was supposed to have a staircase, special staircase.
The staircase came out of the building that was called the Institute. Was it something to do with the mission up in the domain? Mm-hmm. When that building was demolished, Mr. Macmillan got the staircase and put it into his house in Fraser Street.
Right. Did you know any of the George Vesey Stewart descendants when you were living in Katikati?
Well, I knew Buster Turner very well. He was George Vesey Stewart's great-grandson. We were married about much the same time, and eventually they came to live in Tauranga. He was very much associated with St. John's Church out of Muay Thai, lived for a while in Hillcrest Road, where we had lived at one time, and eventually sold that place and moved into 14th Avenue to a very nice unit there. But he eventually became very ill and died a few months ago. He was a good chap, very well liked. And the only other, you remember his mother and his aunt, whom I used to take communion to, Mrs. Stewart, and I can't remember what the aunt's name was. She lived in 8th or 9th Avenue. She had a nice house there. Mrs. Stewart had died before we went to Katikati, I think.
He died about 1920, yes.
Yes.
1922.
Yes, he was a fine man. He was just liked by some people. Mind you, things didn't pan out for many years in Katikati as well as he had hoped. The soil was very, very fertile when it was first cleared, but the fertility was very quickly depleted. And the farmers eventually became very hard up during the terrible depression of the 90s. And it wasn't until prices improved so much during the First World War that they really started to go ahead. Some of them became quite well-to-do eventually, the Morton family. Old Willie Andrews on Thompson's track. He was a really hard-working old man. He had 2 daughters and then, much later, a very spoilt son. Very badly spoilt son. The 2 daughters had to work on the farm. Archie wasn't expected to do much. The old man worked in the gold mines to earn money to break in the farm. He used to walk home at the weekends, work all day on the farm at the weekends, walk back on Sunday night.
No wonder the girls worked.
And the girls had to work. The second one, Mrs. Norman Wright, only died fairly recently, and the oldest resident in the old people's home at Katikati.
Right.
And
Wynnton, did you ever go to Athenry Homestead?
Oh yes. My parents were great friends of Mr. and Mrs. Rapley, and went there several times.
Can you
It
describe?
was a lovely old home at that time, still in very good order. But when they retired, the place was sold to Mr. Lana, who built a new house on the other side of the road and used the old Asbury homestead to store hay and ruined it. Damp, heated hay will bring on dry rot faster than anything else, and he destroyed the house. It was a great, great shame.
What did it look like when you were in there, when it was in its heyday still?
I wasn't in it. I was
you?
never in it. My parents were
Oh, yeah.
several times. Actually, both of Mrs. Rapleys were second cousins of my mother's. It probably hasn't come out clearly in this story, but my mother and father were third cousins. Both my grandmothers were Simons, members of the Simons family. And the 2 Mrs. Rapleys and Mrs. Bagent were all 3 second cousins of my mother's.
Right. Yes, I don't think we did know that.
No.
So you would have been, what, 14, 15 when the railway opened?
1928, I was born in 1908, so I'd have been 20.
20. But 1914 when the first train came over the bridge? 1914.
Well, we may have been away in Taranaki by that time.
Right.
I don't remember it. But I do remember the opening of the railway. It was a wonderful day. And I think the train that pulled in, the engine that pulled in was a wood burner with a great big high stack, if I remember rightly. And, that was wonderful. And I do remember Bishop Cleary coming down the first aeroplane trip to Taranaki in Walsh Brothers seaplane.
Yes.
I remember that. I remember Kingsford Smith landing on the Waikariau.
Did you go up for a flight?
I didn't go. We hadn't any money by that time. That was during the Depression. But we had already had a flight with one of the Walsh Brothers planes. They in those days, even £1 was a lot of money. And he was taking up single passengers for £1 a time. If there was room for 2, it was 10 shillings or two boys. I'm not too sure. It wasn't 5 shillings each. Anyway, my brother and I both had a ride over town. It'd been the quite early 20s, 1920s.
Right.
And
So did they land on the estuary as well?
yes.
Because some planes landed on the Mount Beach, I think, didn't they?
That's right. Kingsford Smith, when the day Kingsford Smith came to Tauranga, the government, a little government plane called the Wacko landed. Kingsford Smith's plane, of course, was a Fokker Trimotor. Very beautiful plane, but she took a fairly long run to get off the ground. It got off the ground very quickly with a little Wacko, which was much faster. Took a very much longer run to get off the ground. I think he did fairly well. A great many people, adults who had their £2 or whatever it was to go up for a flight. I don't know how many he took at the time. I think about 12. And of course, it was very sad when he lost his life. Of course, Ulm had the other Fokker Trimotor. He lost his life.
Dangerous business.
Yes.
So what else happened? Can you remember electricity being put on?
Yes, I remember the electricity being switched on. It was a very exciting day. We ourselves didn't get electricity until 1925, by the time we were up at the farm. And that was a great day when finally the power was turned on. We didn't have to crank up an old engine. We were able to start the milking machine with an electric motor. I remember Mr. Goulding very well. In fact, I looked after Mr. Goulding after he retired for years. He used to take communions at home regularly. And he was a great man. I only vaguely remember the man who designed the power station.
Lord Mandano.
Lord Mandano. I do remember him. And one of my memories is that on Christmas Day 1928, we were picnicking at McLaren's Falls and went into the power station, and the engineer showed us on the dials where they were using power to close the gates at Arapuni.
Right.
Yeah.
Remarkable.
And it was Lloyd Mandano's McLaren's Falls scheme that they first used a coffer dam while they built the concrete dam. There's something very special about it, which afterwards became standard practice in all the big dams on the Waikato River.
He was a very talented man, I think.
Oh, very talented. Apart from the design of the power station, he invented the electric hot water service. I don't know what he didn't invent. I remember when the power was first turned on in the borough, the electrician, this is all just vague memories, went up to see old Mrs. Maxwell and asked her if she would put the power into the elms. And that would, as he could say, as used by Mrs. Maxwell, would help him in his sales. And I think Mrs. Maxwell and Mrs. Corrigan were probably the first people in town to have power. Mrs. Pillins was soon after, well, of course, it had to get to Woodham before she could put it in.
Who was Mrs. Corrigan?
Mrs. Corrigan was the wife of the Bank of New Zealand manager at the time. She was a wealthy woman in her own right. Eventually, she left him. She built a beautiful house in 2nd Avenue, overlooking the harbour, and he took on living at the old Barbrack, where he had retired from the bank for this time, and he used to grow daffodils, or what afterwards was the lawn. When we first came to Tauranga, Dr. Buse lived at Barbrack. It's a strange thing, as I mentioned earlier, my father and my mother were third cousins from the Simons family. Both my grandmothers were Simons, but there are 2 other members of the family in Tauranga who are all third cousins. And one was Dr. Buse and the other was Mr. Pillins. And they were quite recognised, the fact, they were all very good friends and so on.
Of course, Mr. Pillins was an explorer. Mr. Pillins was an explorer, wasn't he?
Was he? Yes. Yes, and he bought this beautiful place at Wynnton and filled it up with treasures and so on. It was very sad what happened to that place eventually. Mr. Pillins was married twice, and each wife had one son. The second Mrs. Pillins, whom I knew very well with great love, didn't get on with her stepson, who eventually went over to South Africa, where he married again, or he married and had one son and one daughter. The second Mrs. Pillins' son, she discouraged from getting married. She was unfortunately a clinging mother. He went to the war as a pilot and was killed in Singapore. Had she encouraged him to get married to the girl he wanted to marry, she might well have had a grandchild. As it was, she was left without any. She sent for her stepson's son to come and be her heir. He was mentally afflicted. I don't know how badly, but didn't get on with Mrs. Pillins, and she eventually had to pay his mother's fare to come and collect him and take him back to South Africa, where he became the gardener for the President of South Africa, his gardener.
Great.
She then paid for his sister to come with her husband and two children, Mr. and Mrs. Lellman, and left all the property to Mrs. Lellman. It was all cut up. And eventually, my house at Meyer Street was actually, I believe, on their cow yard.
Oh, right.
She owned about 10 acres there, I think.
Did you ever see any of the treasures inside the house?
Oh, yes, I stayed there quite often. Well, not quite often, but several times I stayed there.
So do you believe the story about Josephine's curtains?
Oh, yes.
Do you think they were?
Oh, yes. They were still hanging in those days. It was Mary Lellman who took them down. They were found bundled up in a box somewhere, weren't they?
At the historic village.
Yes.
But did Mrs. Pillins talk to you about the fact that they came from the Poole?
She believed that.
Right.
That house was full of treasures, lots of silver. It was very sad. Mary Lellman was very careful about locking up the house when she went out. Fay Horan's house. Fay was our parish secretary for some years. When she left us, she became the curtain specialist for Brereton Furnishing. And she'd had a long trip round the Waikato or somewhere Monday, and her van was fairly muddy and so forth. And she was out at the front of the house, hosing it down. She saw two well-dressed young men stroll up the road. They stood and looked out over the Waikato, and then they disappeared, so she didn't take any notice of them. In the meantime, Mary's younger son had come home, got himself something to eat, and went out, leaving the side door into the dining room unlocked. Sometime later, a car drove rapidly up to the front of the house. A great big tablecloth or something full of treasures was in the car, and away it went.
Gracious.
Mary arrived home a few minutes later and yelled out, "I've been robbed!" They rang the police, who set up roadblocks, but they never got anything. She claimed that she lost $50,000 worth of stuff. Well, she may well have done. There was masses of silver and treasures in that house. And, but anyway, she got a Jaguar car.
Did you know the Tollemaches?
Oh, very well. Oh, yes, because they were about our age. And when we lived at Otamoitai, of course, we used to see a good deal of them. No, neither of us ever went to the Otamoitai school. We used to ride across the estuary when the tide was out. The school paddock was at the bottom of Fifth Avenue. And all that hillside was a school horse paddock. When the tide was in, we had a very gay little Shetland pony. He really was a little wonder. We naughty boys, I mean, we'd even take the risk of somebody who across the channel when the tide was half in, get the scalp the seats of our pants wet. When the tide was right in, we either went up past the Junior Power or rode right round, but it was a long way round to go right round, about 4 miles. I still remember going up past the Junior Power when they were drying shark. The air was literally blue. I don't know how the whales could eat this vile stuff. The smell was so appalling, but they loved it like they loved the corn peel ale, which I believe smelled terrible.
Yeah. Depends what you're used to, I guess.
So
what do you remember about the Tollemaches?
Well, I remember old Mr. Tollemache. He was rather a naughty old man. He used to drink too much. He drove a Dodge car. And one time he drove into Mr. Merriweather Meadows, who's a music teacher, riding a bicycle, knocked him off his bicycle. And he had 1 or 2 lady friends. He had a large family. I think there were 11 children in the family. And his wife was a Anderson, one of the Vesey Stewart families. She was a lovely person, very gentle, and the two that we probably, or the 3 we probably knew the best were Vivian, Ruth, and Saxon. I think they probably went to the town school. I might have been in the high school by that time. I'm not quite sure. But
and where was the Tollemache farm?
The Tollemache farm, well, actually, it was next door to the primary school, and it went right along. I think probably right down the hill
To Autumn Primary School.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was a fairly big farm, but I don't know if the old man ever did much himself. He was very selfish, I think. Later on, after his wife died, he'd retired much among the tapu. This is only a story, of course. This is pure gossip. But he had a housekeeper who wouldn't put up with his nonsense, and if he didn't eat a meal and she put it in front of him at midday, she put the same meal on at night. He had to do what he was told.
And did you know the Mathesons, another Autumn family?
Not really. Alistair Matheson married. Oh, bother, just a second. When I was 20, I went up to work at the trout hatchery on the Tongariro River. The conservator of fish and game at Rotorua was Frank Yerricks, and he was an old-time friend of my family. And so he got me in on this winter work when they were stripping the fish and hatching the ova. I had my 21st birthday while I was up there, and my father came up to see me. Now, my father and Mr. and Mrs. Herbert Mansell and old Mrs. Green, the mother of the Guinnesses, all had their birthdays on August the 6th. Mr. and Mrs. Mansell didn't have a car, but my father had, and so he used to drive them to Mrs. Green's, and she put on the birthday party. She had plenty of money. And anyway, they decided to come up and see me, and it coincided with the opening of the Chateau Tongariro. So Mr. Mansell was a real wag, and his son-in-law, Lionel Crowley, drove them up to see me. And I remember on one occasion, Alistair Matheson was a very ugly man, and Mr. Mansell, introducing him to somebody, said, "You can see he's not two-faced, because if he were, he'd have left that face at home." Horrible! To say. And we had a lovely day at the chateau, we had dinner there and that sort of thing. It was quite an interesting experience I had the 3 years at the chateau. It was quite interesting. In the last year I was there, the conservator was a new conservator. No, this was the Public Service Commissioner, Mr. Verschafeld. he was the sole public service commissioner in those days, came up on his way to Rotorua, and he called in at the hatchery and he offered me a permanent job. I don't know who put him up to it, whether Frank Yerich put him up to it or what, but my job basically was that they were going to build an information bureau at Taupo, which I would be expected to man during the tourist or during the fishing season. And I would have incidentally been the first harbour master at Taupo, and then work at the hatchery during the hatching season when the fishing season was finished. It sounded a very exciting job to a young fellow who was only 21, and I rang up my father to consult him about it, and he lost his temper and was so rude to me that I just dropped the whole thing. It was really rather sad. I don't know, he must have been in a bad mood that day because there wasn't any discussion about it.
Did you ever visit the Yerrick's farm on Cambridge
Oh
Road?
yes, we used to visit them quite regularly. My father was very, very fond of Mr. and Mrs. Yerrick's. He was reputedly a member of a minor German royal family. That's where the name came from. They had quite a big family, and they were really very delightful people. They lived opposite the Mrs. Wallace at Gardenhurst, and of course we used to go there too. In fact, Russell and I were, at quite a young age. I could have been just only going to school. We used to ride Dad's big horse out to Mrs. Wallace's, with Russell clinging on to me on the back. Mr. and Mrs. Walter Bell on Cambridge Road, who's, Mrs. Rina Bell, after it's cut up the farm. And of course they've become extremely wealthy. No, we knew quite a number of the people out there. One of the things we haven't mentioned, of course, was the businesses in town. How many minutes have we got left? 2. Yes. Things have changed so much. I mean, in those days we had 2 coach builders, several wheelwrights, 3 blacksmiths. I could give you another full take.
Wynnton,
you've done enough.
Thank you very much indeed for spending all that time with us today. We've thoroughly enjoyed it, listening to all your stories.
I think you better just finish off now.
We will just wrap up now, and perhaps we will come back to you and ask you to talk a bit more about downtown Tauranga another day. But for today, thank you very much indeed for spending all this time with us. We've had a lovely time.
Thank you for putting all these memories into my head.